the leader of the opposition painted you a picture of an environment that is dire. Yes, that's a problem. But their solution today is to transfer those harms to those that have no responsibility over the problem. Their solution is to transfer the harms to the weakest people. Why? Because they can, ladies and gentlemen. And that was their answer today. Because the fundamental question in today's debate is not whether environmental damages will occur in the developing world. That's obvious. Economic development is going to have environmental damages. The fundamental question is whether that damage can be contained in the developing world without killing those people out, as our Prime Minister said. Therefore, if we examine what side opposition gave us today, we see that all their examples and arguments can be turned on the issue of practicality. But before we go into that, our Prime Minister gave you two very clear points. First of all, on how it destroys the economy. No thank you, sir. Secondly, on how it perpetuates neo-colonialism. Now, on how it destroys the economy, they said only one thing. Well, then why don't we allow them to do it while protecting the environment, because we can simultaneously do it with green technology. But to that we have two rebuttals. First of all, we say it's a fundamental assumption to think that green technology is going to be available to all of these economies. Second assumption, no thank you sir, we say it's fundamentally naive to think that these developed nations are going to automatically transfer these technologies to these nations. For example, in the case of Egypt, the very example they talked about, no thank you sir, technology wasn't transferred because the very organizations Egypt asked for these technologies were ruled by developed nations, which refused to transfer technology. No thank you sir. And then to our argument on dependency, on neo-colonialism. They said, well, then why don't we also do this too? And that MNCs are exactly the problem. But that wasn't really a direct response to our argument, and here's why. No thank you sir. We give a deep analysis on how the environment is going to be an opportunity to enslave developing economies from the perspective of the United States and the United Kingdom. We give the example of Iran on how petroleum is actually benefiting the developed nations instead of these people. So, according to your model, if we exactly apply these green technologies that you're talking about, what's going to happen is that the people that are going to profit from these technologies are going to be developed nations. And this, referring to our past analysis, shows why they have a disincentive to give these technologies in the first place, rendering their model completely untenable. And then they had their substantive of their own, in talking about how the environment was at peril. They give examples of lack of water in Nepal. They talk about resource wars in Sudan. They talk about how the Nile is polluted. They talk about Russia. But the fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, all their examples can be turned, and here's why. Because their fundamental assumption, as we stated in today's debate, is that this is going to be possible. But we proved to you that these green technologies are simply untenable in current status. We say, no thank you sir. That nations such as Sudan, Egypt, simply cannot afford these technologies to sustain their economies at the same time. So essentially what you're doing is backing these nations into a corner, forcing them to develop these technologies for the cost of their lives of their citizens. And in the case of Nepal, the very example they stated, the reason these people do not have clean water is because they do not have the technology to purify it in the first place. And we say that's a fundamental problem they're neglecting. In Sudan, we say it's also the nation with the most forest areas in the world, according to Time. No thank you sir. But the fact of the matter is the pollution that's most done is done by the United States of America, which is not taking responsibility for economic sanctions they're willing to impose. The example of Russia totally turns their whole case, because it inherently proves that developed nations also have spillover effects. The environmental effects they're talking about, how developing nations are going to affect other nations, are exactly what developed nations have been doing for the past decades. In a moment, I'll take you, sir. But their argumentation is that they have to take responsibility because of spillovers. But the spillovers actually happen because of developed nations as well, on a far greater aspect. And therefore, the proportionate damage is far greater. Yes, sir.
So is China or is China not responsible for harming the environment, and do you or do you not?
We already clearly explained in the response to your POI that China is a developing nation, but because it has gained enough capital to take environmental initiative, it is doing so. And this is the model that we want to see from developing nations as well. I'm answering the POI, no thank you, sir. We see that developing nations will take on this model, that they will, once gain the capital, develop nuclear power plants, that they will recruit more than 100 scientists to reach solar and hydro technology more than any other nation. And that's what we want to see. We see that it's completely untenable under your model because you don't allow them to have the money to do so. So let's move on to my own constructive matter. On our third argument, how this perpetuates irresponsibility. We see the environment is at peril. Okay, but why should the burdens of the problem be felt by developing nations? The fact is that the biggest polluters in the past and present, in terms of land, air, and water, no thank you sir, are the developed nations in terms of history. The United States of America in the past 2 decades has polluted 6,007 million megatons, and their pollution rates haven't been decreasing as they said it would happen if they're rich enough. What happens is that they've been increasing by 25%, I'll take you in a moment, in these past 2 decades. And we say that nations such as Sudan, nations such as Bangladesh, should not be the ones that should be held responsible for the mistakes of these nations. What do you say to that, sir?
Even if we accept the idea that emissions control hasn't succeeded in the developed world, isn't environmental protection a much larger idea than that, which includes things like sustainable development?
The fact of the matter is, what you're saying is that we all have to take responsibility for what America does. And what we're saying, we're sick of that. Because if America made a mistake in the past, it's their problem, and your solution of one rule book for one world is not going to work. Because some people played by the rules, some people didn't, and those are the ones that should be punished, not the good citizens. No thank you, sir. And to continue on to my constructive, we say it's simply unfair. And not only is it unfair, but that we're going to burden these barely sustaining economies such as Bangladesh and punishing them with carbon sanctions. We say that it's simply irresponsible that nations such as India has to take responsibility for the carbon emissions of the United States and the United Kingdom. We see that, no thank you sir, that Eurasia and North America contributes to 50% of the pollution we have, and while South Central America plus Africa contributes less than 10%. Therefore, what they're saying doesn't really hold. No thank you sir. We say this actually perpetuates a cycle of irresponsibility. The mistake that these developed nations have committed in the past are transferred to the developing nations, and they're the ones that are going to suffer the consequences. And we say that's simply wrong. And to continue this analysis, we say that if this transferring responsibility is condoned, that this is going to create a vicious cycle, which is precisely the reason that India's Prime Minister, Mohammed Singh, explicitly refused to agree to the Copenhagen Accords and also the Kyoto Protocol. Why? Because they refused to take responsibility for the mistakes of other nations. And we say, if this continues, if we sanction developing nations for polluting because they want to survive, what's going to happen is that developed nations are going to pollute as well. And that the world has become a backyard for their pollution. And the developing world is not going to get their chance of survival, but be degraded into garbage men for these nations. Because obviously, according to their world model, they're going to be the ones held responsible for their pollution. And we say that's simply wrong. So ladies and gentlemen, where do we stand today? The environment is at peril, that's conceded. But the green technology that is required to protect the environment in the first place is simply untenable in these economies. And asking them to implement those technologies is asking them to commit economic suicide. And we say, what's required is making sure that the economies are sustained, that as people survive, and if it grows into large economies such as China, they will invest in resources, and that's when we protect the environment, not when we kill its people in the status quo. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.